An unanswered knock, a chilling silence. Welcome to Twilight Clue. I am your host, Langford. I love hearing from you. Drop a comment and share where you're tuning in from. Your voices bring these mysteries alive. Let's dive in. It was the rain that persuaded me to take the longer way home. I have always preferred Oxford in its quieter moods, when the cobbles gleam like polished bone, and the towers wear their water-darkened robes with indifferent dignity. On such evenings, one hears the city differently. The trickle of gutters, the sigh of sodden branches, the faint hiss of tires on wet tarmac. Even footsteps seem reluctant to break the silence. I walked slowly, coat pulled tighter than necessary, prolonging my solitude as if it were something earned. It was then that I saw the door, not much to remark upon at first glance. Paint peeled back in flakes, the wood swollen with damp, the knocker dulled to an anonymous brass. It belonged to one of the college-owned houses that cling to the edge of the lane, places half forgotten, their tenants seldom noticed. Yet on that night the door stood ajar, open just wide enough to suggest intrusion or forgetfulness. A wedge of darkness pressed against the rain. I stopped, listening. There was no voice, only the faint scrape of something shifting within. Perhaps a chair leg drawn across the boards. Perhaps imagination. I told myself to move on. Still I lingered. Open doors unsettle me more than locked ones. They invite questions that seldom find answers. I left it behind eventually, though not without turning twice to check if it had closed of its own accord. It had not. By morning the city had resumed its facade of order. The college quads glistened with yesterday's rain, and the porter, broom in hand, swore under his breath at a drain already clogged with leaves. Lewis stood beside me, impatient as ever, a man unsoftened by Oxford's tendency to cloak tragedy in ceremony. He told me of a death. Margaret Copley, lecturer of English, well regarded in a minor sort of way, found lifeless in her rooms during the night. The physician pronounced heart failure. Nothing unusual, except that an unsigned letter had arrived on the master's desk hinting otherwise. I asked what it said, though I already knew it would be brief. Lewis frowned, repeating the words carefully as though they might change if spoken differently. She heard a knock, but no one was there. That was all. We walked together across the quad, our shoes tapping lightly against the stone. Students hurried past us with heads bent against the drizzle, unconcerned, as if death were another rumor to be filed away. I thought of the door in the rain, the one I had seen ajar, and for a moment the two images bled into one another. A woman startled by a sound, an opening that should have remained closed. Lewis dismissed the letter as nonsense. Students with too much time, perhaps, or a colleague with a taste for melodrama. I nodded, though my mind resisted such easy resolutions. Letters without names are rarely written without intent. They exist to trouble, to prick, to remind. Later that day I found myself in the college library. The place smelt of damp paper and polish, the air heavy with the ghosts of unread books. A poster on the notice board caught my eye, a faded announcement for a poetry reading long past. Beneath it, in hurried handwriting, someone had scrawled a line. Between the idea and the reality falls the shadow. Misquoted, of course, though most would never notice. I did. Margaret's death already felt like that line, the shadow between what was expected and what was real. I left the library with Elliot circling in my thoughts, along with the half-open door and the sound of rain against stone. A beginning, perhaps, though at the time I told myself it was nothing at all. The truth is, I knew better. The inn was one of those places Oxford keeps tucked away in the quieter folds of its streets, discreet, respectable, neither proud nor shabby. I had passed it countless times without the faintest curiosity. Yet that morning, with Margaret Copley's death still fresh in my mind, and the anonymous letter folded somewhere in Lewis's pocket, the place drew me in as though it had been waiting all along. The air inside smelled faintly of old wood and the aftertaste of last night's ale. A fire smouldered with more resignation than warmth, and a pair of early patrons sat silently with their newspapers, hardly lifting their eyes as we entered. Lewis, purposeful, asked the innkeeper for the register. I watched the man fetch it from beneath the counter, his fingers moving with the absent-minded efficiency of habit. He had no idea he was carrying a fragment of someone's story. He placed it before us, the binding cracked from years of use. I have always felt a peculiar intimacy in such volumes, the neat procession of names, addresses, dates, as though life itself could be catalogued and reduced to ink. Each entry an affirmation of presence, a whispered declaration, "I was here." Margaret's name appeared clearly, her hand steady, unpretentious. A Thursday evening 2 days before her death, and beneath it another, William Ainsworth. The writing at once careful and contrived, as though every curve of every letter had been rehearsed, too deliberate to be natural, too cautious to be carefree. It had the uneasy balance of someone imitating their own disguise. Lewis read it over my shoulder. "Could be genuine enough," he said, in that tone of his that meant he considered the matter settled. But I lingered, tracing the strokes with my eyes, letting the peculiar neatness settle into memory. There was something in the way the pen had pressed harder on certain downstrokes, betraying the writer's tension. Writing tells more truth than words ever do. The address given was Banbury Road, though the number looked smudged, as if amended at the last second. I remembered a crossword clue I had puzzled over earlier that morning, its answer a simple anagram, Banbury. Coincidence, perhaps, but Oxford has taught me to be wary of coincidences. They behave less like chance and more like patterns waiting to be seen. We asked the innkeeper about this Ainsworth. He furrowed his brow, scratched his chin, and recalled little more than a man who ordered a single whisky, neat, and left without staying the night. No luggage, no conversation, no impression worth holding on to. Margaret had been present that same evening, though, curiously, no one could say if they spoke. Lewis gave a small shrug. "A dead end," he muttered. Perhaps it was. But I have learned that dead ends are often the most revealing. They force you to notice what is missing, rather than what is there. As we stepped back outside, the rain had thinned to a mist that softened the outlines of the buildings. Lewis lit a cigarette and spoke of practicalities, reports, interviews, questions to be asked. I half listened, my thoughts circling instead around that register. The way the ink had dried a little darker on one name than the others, as though unwilling to fade. There are names that live, names that vanish, and names that hover uneasily between. William Ainsworth belonged to the last category, a presence that wished to be both known and forgotten. I could not yet see how he belonged to Margaret Copley's death, but I felt certain that he did. Registers may appear empty, but it is the gaps, the half-smudged addresses and the overly careful hands, that fill them with meaning. And as we turned back toward the college, the echo of that unsigned letter followed me still, insistent and unresolved, like the faint memory of a knock at a door that ought never to have been opened. Eleanor Dalrymple received us in a drawing-room that seemed to have paused somewhere between mourning and survival. The curtains were heavy, the air faintly perfumed with polish and age, and the books on the shelves leaned against each other as if weary of standing alone. She carried herself with the composure of someone long practiced in silence. A widow of a professor fallen from grace, she had cultivated dignity like armor. She asked if we would take tea, her voice courteous, neutral, the syllables clipped with just enough precision to suggest effort. I declined, though Lewis accepted, and while she busied herself with the tray, I studied the room. On the mantel stood a photograph of her late husband, his expression stern, his eyes slightly averted as though caught off guard by his own pose. The frame was polished to a gleam. Beside it, incongruous, a vase of fresh lilies. Their scent was heavy, almost oppressive, masking something older in the air, a bitterness that had seeped into the walls. When she returned to her chair, she folded her hands with deliberation. The way one closes a book one has no wish to finish. I asked if she had known Margaret Copley well. She smiled with the faintest trace of irony. We were acquainted, yes. Once upon a time we saw rather more of each other. But people drift, Inspector. One cannot expect friendships to last forever. Her eyes lingered on the lilies as she spoke, and I wondered if she were offering a confession of sorts, not of crime, but of abandonment. Margaret, I sensed, had been more to her once, perhaps a friend, perhaps something closer. Whatever it was, it had curdled into distance. Lewis asked bluntly when she had last seen her. A fortnight ago, perhaps longer. Eleanor spoke without hesitation, but her tone carried something rehearsed. Then, as if to change the subject, she quoted Eliot, or thought she did. "Humankind cannot stand much truth," she said, her voice carrying the words with solemn gravity. But she had altered them subtly, replacing the definite with the indefinite. Not truth, but the truth. The difference was small, but it caught at me like a thread loose in a tapestry. I let the moment pass without remark, though my mind would not let it go. Misquotations are curious things. They reveal what the speaker wishes to believe rather than what was written. Eleanor Dalrymple, I thought, could not stand much truth. Lewis pressed further, but she deflected with elegance. Margaret was reliable, respectable, a woman of routine. It was difficult, she admitted, to imagine her gone. And yet she said it with the faintest relief, as though a weight had been lifted. I asked what Margaret feared, if anything. Eleanor looked at me directly for the first time, her eyes grey, steady, unblinking. Fear? She feared very little, Inspector. That was perhaps her mistake. We left shortly after, Lewis muttering that the widow had told us nothing. I did not answer. She had told us enough. In her careful composure, her softened misquotation, her deliberate distance from a woman once close, she had revealed the outline of something not yet visible. Outside, the rain had resumed, tapping against the flagstones in patient rhythm. I paused under the eaves, watching the droplets slide down the stonework. The widow's words, her slight alteration of Eliot, circled in my mind. Humankind cannot bear very much reality. Yet she had chosen truth, a narrower word, a harder word. I wondered which truth she could not bear, and whether Margaret had forced her to face it. I lit a cigarette, though I let it burn mostly unattended between my fingers, and thought of the lilies beside the photograph. Fresh flowers for a dead man, yet none, as far as I could see, for a woman more recently gone. It was a detail easily overlooked. But such details have a way of surviving in memory, long after grander statements fade. The porter at St. Fridayswide's had been there longer than most of the dons combined. To a tall, thinning man with a limp that seemed to deepen in the rain, he carried in his manner the weary discretion of one who had seen too much and chosen to forget most of it. When I asked about Margaret Copley, his brow furrowed as though he were turning the name over in his mind, like a coin found at the bottom of a pocket. Yes, he remembered her. A courteous woman, punctual, always the same light step across the quad. It was not her routine that lingered with him, though. He recalled a remark she had made only a week before her death. She had come to collect her post one evening, and with a half-smile she told him she had been kept awake by a knocking at her door. Not once, but several times. She laughed when she said it, waved her hand as though to brush the thought aside, yet something in her eyes had given him pause. There had been no one there when she opened the door, she said. Just the empty corridor and silence pressing in. Lewis dismissed it with a shake of his head. Students, he muttered. Late-night pranks. A knock and a scurry down the stairs. But the porter swore he had checked the stairwell that night himself and found no trace of movement. The place had been deserted. He said it with such quiet certainty that I believed him. I walked the corridor later, my footsteps echoing against the stone, the walls sweating faint damp into the air. Each door identical, painted the same dull color, their brass numbers dulled by years of fingers passing. I stopped at hers. Closed now, sealed, its key removed. I placed my hand against the wood and felt nothing, no pulse of life behind it. Yet in my mind I could almost hear the faint rap of knuckles, persistent and unanswered. Back in my rooms I turned over the words she had written in her diary, the one page that had survived the fire. The knock again at 3, not a soul in sight. Written with the restraint of someone unwilling to exaggerate, unwilling even to admit fear. 3 o'clock, that most arbitrary of hours, when time feels neither night nor morning, when thought collapses into dreams and half-dreams. It struck me that she had recorded the detail as one might note the clue of a crossword, uncertain yet convinced of its importance. Later that evening, with the rain once more fretting against the windows, I opened the paper and stared at the crossword. One clue caught my attention. 5 letters, sound that comes but leaves nothing. The answer, of course, was knock. Too obvious, too simple, yet the coincidence disturbed me. A word that means both presence and absence, both demand and emptiness. Margaret had heard the sound, but there was no one to give it substance. Lewis telephoned as I sat with the puzzle half finished. He said there was still no trace of this William Ainsworth, no lodging at the Banbury Road address given. A name then as hollow as the knock itself. He thought it a waste of time to pursue further. I poured myself a measure of whiskey and considered the symmetry. A false name entered in careful script, A knock with no one behind it. Both gestures designed to create the illusion of substance where none existed. The truth, I thought, lay not in what was present but in what refused to appear. And as the night deepened, I found myself listening for sounds in my own corridor. The shuffle of feet, the weight of a step on wood, the faint tap of a knuckle against a door. Nothing came. Only silence, thicker than the whiskey in my glass, heavier than the rain beyond the window. The chapel at St. Friedwide's was never meant for grandeur. Its pale stone seemed subdued, the stained glass more faded than luminous, as though it had absorbed centuries of prayer until only quietness remained. I stepped inside one late afternoon, the rain easing for once, and the air carried that particular mingling of candle wax and damp hymnals that I had always found oddly consoling. It was there I first saw James Latham, a boy of 19 perhaps, though in Oxford such ages can feel simultaneously young and ancient. He sat at the organ bench, his hands poised above the keys without playing. The posture alone betrayed something. Not reverence, not concentration, but hesitation, the pause of someone uncertain whether to speak or to remain forever silent. When Lewis introduced us, the boy's eyes darted quickly, then settled downward, as though studying the floorboards could protect him. I asked if he had known Margaret Copley well. He answered softly that she had often invited him to her rooms for tea, to discuss music, poetry, sometimes even crosswords. She had an interest in the cryptic ones, he added. Though she was better with words than with numbers, there was a flicker of a smile, brief and ashamed, as though he had revealed too much intimacy in that detail. Lewis pressed, blunt as always, whether others had noticed his visits. The boy's fingers gripped the edge of the bench, whitening at the knuckles. Some of the choir, perhaps. Rumours spread easily. He looked away when he said it, and I noticed the faint flush creeping up his neck. The implication was there, unspoken yet thick in the air. A woman of 40, a student not yet 20. Impropriety suggested, though not confirmed. Lewis, ever the pragmatist, seized on it at once. But I remained unconvinced. Margaret Copley's nature, from what I had gathered, leaned more towards mentorship than seduction. And the boy's unease struck me less as guilt than as fear rehearsed, even performed, as though he had practiced this posture of shame in anticipation of questions. I asked what they spoke of, those afternoons over tea. Music, he said again. She liked Vaughan Williams, though he preferred Purcell. She showed him her books, her marginalia in Eliot and Donne. He hesitated, then admitted she had confided something once, that she was troubled by knocks at her door late at night. She had laughed when she told him, but she wrote it down too. He had seen the diary himself. The boy spoke this last part with the tremor of someone who half regretted revealing it. Lewis asked if he thought she feared someone. The boy shook his head, then said she believed it was nothing. Yet his voice caught, and his hands returned to hover above the organ keys, pressing down a single note as though to fill the silence. The sound lingered too long, sharp against the stillness of the chapel, before fading into nothing. I found myself watching the sheet music open on the stand. A hymn, its staves penciled with faint annotations. One word had been circled, shadow. The coincidence struck me. Margaret's diary had spoken of a knock at 3, no soul in sight. Eliot's misquoted line returned to me. Between the idea and the reality falls the shadow. Here again was that word surfacing where it need not. A theme, perhaps. Or simply a reflection of how language leaks from one mind into another. We left the boy in the chapel, his shoulders hunched, his face turned away. Lewis muttered that it was plain enough. A scandal waiting to break, motive enough for panic, perhaps for murder. I said nothing, though the neatness of it disturbed me. Outside, the rain had ceased altogether, leaving the flagstones slick and shining. The choir's rehearsal drifted faintly through the stone walls, voices pure, untroubled, unaware of how easily innocence can be mistaken for guilt. I lit a cigarette, drew in the smoke, and thought of the boy pressing a single note into silence, as though testing the weight of absence, and for the first time I wondered if Margaret's death was less about what had happened, and more about what she believed might yet come. Margaret's rooms had already been cleared of their immediate traces. The porter, with his cautious tread and faint smell of tobacco, unlocked the door for us and stood back as though reluctant to enter. The air inside was heavy with the stale perfume of extinguished life, cold tea, paper long-handled, and the faint scorched tang of ash. The grate held what remained of her diary. A scatter of charred paper clung to the iron bars, black edges curled inward like the fingers of a hand in rigor. Lewis crouched and stirred the fragments with a pencil, but most crumbled at once, dissolving into powder. Only one page had survived intact, though singed at the corners as though spared by a quirk of draught. The knock again, at 3. Not a soul in sight. The words sat stark upon the lined paper, without ornament, almost reluctant to exist. I carried it to the desk beneath the window, where the glass filmed over with condensation blurred the outlines of the quad outside. There was little else upon the desk. A lamp with a cracked shade, 2 fountain pens, a pile of crosswords clipped from newspapers. The grids bore her neat script, mostly completed, though never entirely. She had a tendency to abandon puzzles just shy of completion, as though some instinct told her answers should never quite fill all the spaces. I traced a finger over one half-solved clue. 6 letters vanished suddenly. She had written fade. Correct yet tentative, the pencil strokes lighter than elsewhere, as though she doubted even the truth she had found. Lewis muttered that the diary proved nothing. She had been unnerved by knocks, that was all. Many women lived alone, heard things, imagined worse. He stood with his hands in his pockets, gazing at the cold hearth. Perhaps she had meant to destroy the diary herself. Perhaps she had feared her own imaginings being discovered. But I could not help wondering why only certain pages had been torn out, burned, erased. Her diary is a peculiar thing, half confession, half deception. To remove fragments is to curate one's own absence. Someone, I thought, wanted parts of Margaret's life excised, as though by removing words they could erase reality itself. The porter shuffled outside in the corridor, his keys jangling softly. The building creaked in sympathy, a timbered groan that carried through the floorboards. I closed my eyes for a moment and imagined her here at 3 in the morning, awakened by a sound. The clock ticking loud in the silence, her feet against the boards, her hand at the latch. The door opening upon nothing, and then the careful recording of it in her diary, as though by writing she could prove that emptiness had substance. I folded the surviving page and slipped it into my pocket. Evidence, yes, but also something more intimate. The voice of a woman speaking only to herself, overheard by me long after she was gone. As we left, I paused in the stairwell. The banister was worn smooth where countless hands had trailed in descent. Midway down, a mark caught my attention, faint scratches against the wood, almost like the hesitant beginnings of letters carved and then abandoned. N.A. perhaps, or the ghost of one. I leaned closer, tracing the indentation with my thumb. Not deep enough to be deliberate, but too precise to be accident. The name from the register, William Ainsworth, returned unbidden. Coincidence again, or the echo of a presence. Lewis called from below, impatient to be gone. I let the matter rest for the moment, though I carried the impression with me as surely as the page in my pocket. Outside, dusk had begun its slow descent, the sky washed with that colourless grey unique to Oxford evenings when rain hesitates but never quite arrives. The cobbles gleamed faintly, as though storing the memory of earlier storms. I lit a cigarette and considered the diary, the crossword, the carved mark. Words half finished, clues abandoned, names incomplete. A life unravelling not by declaration, but by omission. And I wondered, as the smoke curled upward into the damp air, whether the truth of Margaret Copley's death lay not in what had been said, but in what had been torn away. The wine merchant's shop sat at the corner of Holywell Street, a place where the air seemed forever infused with the ghost of oak casks and the sweetness of cork. I had passed it countless times without entering, but on that afternoon it was Julia Forster I had come to see. Her father's name still adorned the window in faded gold leaf, though he had been gone nearly 5 years. The daughter had inherited not only the business, but the air of someone accustomed to surviving on stubbornness alone. She greeted me with a cool civility that verged on disdain. She was younger than I expected, though the set of her shoulders belonged to someone who had fought too many small battles against creditors, customers, and perhaps herself. I explained the reason for my visit, and she waved it aside with a flick of the hand, as though accustomed to dealing with inconveniences she did not wish to discuss. Margaret Copley had once lent her money, she admitted. A temporary arrangement, nothing more. The debt had been settled in principle, though she avoided saying whether in full. The shop itself was dim, bottles stacked in neat rows that seemed almost ecclesiastical in their order. Dust lay on the older vintages, a fine patina of years. Julia moved among them with quick certainty, her fingers brushing labels as though they were prayer beads. She spoke of Margaret in the way one might speak of a distant teacher, respect tinged with irritation. Margaret had believed in her once, encouraged her to apply for a bursary to take her studies further. But Julia had chosen differently. The business had required her, and Oxford dreams were expensive. Lewis asked bluntly if resentment had grown from that debt. Julia laughed, though without mirth. Resentment, she said, was a luxury she could not afford. Yet in the silence that followed, I thought I heard something harder beneath her words, a brittle pride that covered humiliation. I found myself studying the counter, where a ledger lay open. Names, dates, sums, some crossed through, others underlined. Among them was Margaret's name, recorded neatly, the figures precise. Not erased, not forgiven, simply noted. I traced the line with my eyes and saw a faint smudge beside it, as though someone had tried to wipe it clean but lost the will halfway. I closed the ledger quietly, though the impression stayed with me. Julia poured a measure of sherry for herself, not offering us any, and leaned against the counter with deliberate poise. Margaret, she said, had always been too sure of herself, too certain that others needed her guidance. She had a way of making debts feel like lessons, obligations like moral tests. Julia's eyes flashed briefly, then softened as though she regretted the candor. She changed the subject, asking whether Oxford's colleges still filled their cellars with claret they could no longer afford. It was in that shift, that sudden elegance of redirection, that I felt the tug of memory, the crossword I had worked the night before. Her clue with the answer debt, but phrased curiously. That which is owed yet never forgiven. I had thought the definition too moral, too personal for a crossword compiler. And here was Julia, embodying precisely that sentiment. As we left, Lewis muttered that the woman was hiding something, that pride and poverty made for dangerous companions. I did not disagree, but I also thought of the lilies in Eleanor Dalrymple's drawing room, the choirboy's single trembling note in the chapel, the diary pages reduced to ash. Each clue pointed in different directions, yet together they seemed to form a pattern I could not yet discern. Outside, the evening light slanted across the wet cobbles, turning them briefly to silver. Julia remained in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the rows of bottles behind her, like a figure trapped in a stained glass window of her own making. She lifted the glass of sherry once more, raised it almost in mock salute, then turned away. I stood for a moment, listening to the faint clink of bottles settling in their racks, a sound like echoes in a crypt, and I thought of debts, how they linger long after the accounts are closed, haunting both giver and receiver in ways no ledger can contain. By the time we returned to the college, the day had grown darker than it ought to have been. Clouds pressed low, the light thin and colourless, as though the city itself were tiring of pretense. Lewis walked beside me with that brisk step of his, that always suggested certainty where none should exist. He had by then decided that the case was near enough solved. He spoke of James Latham, the choir scholar, his nervous gestures, the impropriety that everyone whispered but no one confirmed. A young man, vulnerable, fearful of disgrace. A woman older, in possession of authority. Confrontation, panic. A push perhaps, or an overdose given in desperation. Margaret dead, the boy safe from exposure. It fitted neatly, too neatly. Lewis laid it out in his blunt fashion, his voice carrying the comfort of symmetry. I listened, though uneasily. A case that clicks into place like the final word in a crossword can be the most dangerous. Too often it is not the right answer at all, but one that happens to fit the grid. We questioned the boy again in the chapel, where the air was still scented faintly with wax and damp stone. His eyes widened as Lewis pressed him. He denied, then faltered, then denied again, his voice breaking like a poorly tuned note. I watched his hands tremble against the organ keys. Guilt, Lewis whispered later. I thought otherwise. Guilt and fear are kin, but one holds its breath while the other cries for air. Still, I let the lie settle for a time. A satisfying lie can soothe as much as truth, at least temporarily. Reports could be written, statements filed, the case placed into a neat folder with a label that concealed its disquiet. But I could not escape the memory of Margaret's diary. The knock again at 3. Not a soul in sight. Words that belonged not to panic, but to endurance. She had endured something, not fled from it. That evening, back in my rooms, I spread the surviving crossword clippings across the desk. Margaret's handwriting, neat, deliberate, often incomplete. She had written answers in pencil, fading towards the edges. On one grid, a clue remained unsolved, 8 letters meaning plausible yet false. She had left it blank. The answer, of course, was specious. I stared at the empty space she had abandoned and thought of Lewis's theory. Plausible, yes. False, perhaps. I poured a measure of whiskey, though it remained largely untouched. Outside, the rain began again, rattling softly against the glass. I let the sound settle around me, thinking of Margaret, of the boy, of Julia with her brittle pride, of Eleanor Dalrymple and her careful misquotation. Each story felt convincing when held alone. Together they contradicted. A case, I have learned, is rarely solved by the most satisfying lie. It unravels instead at the thread that seems most trivial, most dismissible. That thread had not yet revealed itself, but I could feel its presence, as surely as one senses a draught in a closed room. Lewis, content for the moment, wished to close the matter. I allowed him his certainty, though I knew it would not last. Cases seldom obey the shape we try to force upon them. They twist, evade, and remind us that truth has no obligation to be satisfying. I turned out the lamp and sat in the dark for a long while, listening for sounds beyond the rain. Nothing came, only the quiet reminder that the neatest solutions often conceal the deepest lies. Morning found me again at my desk, the crossword folded neatly beside a half-drunk cup of cold tea. I had slept poorly, my mind circling around Lewis's tidy theory like a moth trapped against glass. The boy's fear had been real, yes, but fear alone does not write anonymous letters nor burn diaries to ash. I unfolded the paper, pencil poised, and let the grid stare back at me. One clue halted me. 7 letters, absence mistaken for presence. The answer came slowly, as answers often do when the mind is elsewhere. Shadow. I penciled it in and sat back. A word that had trailed me all through this case, in Margaret's notes, in Eliot's line misquoted by Eleanor, in the boy's circled hymn sheet. Always there, half real, half not, I thought again of the letter. She heard a knock, but no one was there. I had read those words more than once, yet something had eluded me until now. The phrasing was curious, too precise. It lacked the natural imperfection of panic. It was written, I realized, as though by someone who wished their words to be read twice. And I had obliged. Lewis arrived with his usual energy, tossing his rain-spotted coat across a chair. He asked if I had settled it in my head, if I believed the boy guilty or not. I told him theories are dangerous things, especially when they satisfy. He frowned, muttered something about overcomplicating matters, and lit a cigarette he could barely keep alight. I let him smoke in silence. The day dragged me back to the college library, where dust lay thick upon forgotten shelves and the smell of paper clung to the air like damp wool. I stood by the notice board again, staring at the poster with its scrawled line of Eliot. Between the idea and the reality falls the shadow. Except Eleanor had said truth. Not truth as in the broad abstract sense, but the truth. Personal, pointed, narrow. A small shift, but telling. People reveal themselves most in what they change, not in what they repeat. A student brushed past me, dropping his books with a clatter on the table. He apologized and hurried away, but in that fleeting moment, I noticed a detail I had ignored before. Margaret's handwriting in the crossword clippings, delicate, unfinished, and beside them a different hand in the margins, firmer, more insistent, supplying the words she had left blank. A dialogue of sorts, though silent. 2 minds sharing one puzzle. I slipped one of the clippings into my pocket. Evidence, perhaps, or only a token of the doubt that gnawed at me. Back outside, the rain had ceased, leaving the pavement slick and gleaming. Lewis asked what I had found, but I told him nothing. Not yet. A thought half-born is better left unsaid until it has taken form. Walking back across the quad, I heard the faintest echo, not real, perhaps only imagined, of knuckles on wood. A knock unanswered, or a word crossed wrongly. I could not tell. That evening I returned to the grid. The word shadow stared up at me, dark against the whiteness, a reminder that sometimes the wrong answer fits, and the right answer hides in plain sight. Margaret had lived in a world of words, and words had betrayed her. I wondered if she had known who left those careful corrections in her puzzles, who insisted on finishing what she had left undone. I poured a measure of whiskey and let it sit untouched on the desk. The truth, I knew, was close, but it waited in silence, like a knock at a door no one dared to open. It was in the library archive that the silence pressed most insistently, a silence broken only by the soft flutter of pages, turned by unseen hands, and the occasional shuffle of shoes across stone. The place smelt of dust, polish, and something older, the faintly sour odor of paper left too long in drawers, carrying the weight of forgotten words. I had spent enough hours in such rooms to know that the past never rests quietly. It leaks through in fragments, marginalia, inscriptions, photographs. The archivist, a woman of indeterminate age with pince-nez balanced precariously on the bridge of her nose, produced the college photograph albums with all the reluctance of one surrendering sacred relics. Bound in leather, their spines cracked, they carried within them the careful arrangements of faces, staring at lenses as if eternity had been promised in exchange for composure. I leafed through the pages slowly, letting the faces emerge from sepia shadows. Students in gowns, dons with heavy beards, the occasional woman at the margin of the frame, anomalies in a world still determined to pretend otherwise. And then I found her. Margaret Copley, younger, sharper around the eyes, standing beside Eleanor Dalrymple, and between them, the disgraced professor, whose reputation had collapsed like a building condemned. The professor's expression was curiously stiff, his smile too rehearsed, the jaw clenched beneath it. Eleanor stood too close, her body angled towards him rather than the camera, the hint of possession betrayed in the tilt of her head. And Margaret. Margaret was caught half-turned, her gaze directed neither at the lens nor at her companions, but somewhere beyond. A look of unease, perhaps even resistance. Three people bound together, yet their alignments told a story the caption beneath did not. Lewis glanced at the page and muttered that it proved little. "Just an old photograph," he said. "Everyone looked guilty when you stared long enough." He closed the book with more force than necessary, as if hoping to end the conversation with the action. But I opened it again, returning to the page. It was not what the photograph showed, but what it implied. I studied the caption written beneath in a careful, slanted hand. Names listed in order, but something curious. Margaret's surname misspelled, an E where there should have been an A. A slip, perhaps. Or perhaps not. I thought of Eleanor's misquotation of Eliot, the way she had altered one word with such deliberate certainty. People reveal themselves in what they choose to change. I let the archivist return the albums to their drawer, her expression faintly irritated by our intrusion. As we left, I asked if the college had ever sought to distance itself from the professor after his disgrace. She hesitated, adjusted her glasses, and said quietly that reputations endure longer in Oxford than people. The photograph, she implied, was kept not despite the scandal, but because of it. Memory here was less about honor than about ownership. Back in the quad, the air had turned colder, the stone glistening from a recent shower. Students hurried past, their chatter drifting in fragments, oblivious to the weight of history pressing from the walls around them. I stood for a moment, letting the damp air settle in my lungs. The image of the three figures lingered, Eleanor leaning, Margaret resisting, the professor straining beneath his smile. Later, alone in my rooms, I poured whiskey and unfolded the clipping of Margaret's crossword once more. The empty space she had left unanswered seemed to mirror her gaze in the photograph, directed away, unfinished, unwilling to conform. "Shadow," I wrote in lightly, though the grid resisted the word. I erased it again, and I thought of photographs, how they promise permanence yet capture only the mask, never the truth beneath. The truth survives elsewhere, in the tilt of a head, the misprint of a name, the word left unanswered in a crossword puzzle. I went to Eleanor Dalrymple's house in the late evening, when the lamps along the street cast pools of muted light on the wet pavement, the sort of light that seems designed to expose flaws rather than conceal them. She opened the door herself, her composure intact, though I thought her eyes carried the faint exhaustion of someone who has rehearsed too many performances. She ushered me into the same drawing room as before. The lilies remained on the mantel, though their edges had browned faintly. their perfume grown heavier, almost cloying. The photograph of her late husband still presided, his eyes caught in that permanent avoidance of the camera. I declined tea once more. She did not offer it twice. I told her what I had found, the photograph in the archive. Margaret's gaze turned away, her name misspelled beneath. Eleanor sat very still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When I mentioned the misquotation of Eliot, her lips pressed together in what might have been irritation, or grief, or both. She asked if I had come for truth or for confession. The question was delivered lightly, but I heard the weight beneath it. I told her truth is rarely given, more often stumbled upon. She gave a short, brittle laugh and said that Margaret had always been fond of stumbling. It was not cruelty, not quite, more the bitterness of someone who has been forced to carry too much silence. She began slowly, haltingly, as though words were shards to be handled with care. Margaret had discovered something she should not have, papers in the professor's archive, that revealed the extent of his deceit and Eleanor's complicity in it. Fraud, plagiarism, the quiet thefts of scholarship that had destroyed his reputation, but not entirely exposed hers. Margaret had threatened, not in anger, but in that calm certainty of hers. She would reveal it. She believed truth could not remain buried. The knock, Eleanor said, had been no prank. It was Margaret's metaphor, her way of describing the inevitability of exposure, of guilt's approach. The sound at the door was only in her mind, yet it kept her awake, reminding her that secrets like visitors would not remain outside forever. Eleanor's voice thinned as she admitted what followed. Margaret was unwell, already weak. A small vial of morphine had been left in Eleanor's possession after her husband's illness. She told herself it was mercy, a kindness, though she knew it was not. She had poured the dose into tea, watched Margaret drink it without suspicion. A quiet death, an end without violence. She spoke without tears. Only once did her composure falter, when she glanced at the lilies, now tired and curling at the edges. She said she had placed them there for Margaret, not her husband, though she could never admit it aloud. Then she fell silent, the words having spent themselves, leaving only the slow tick of the clock on the mantel. Lewis would later call it a confession, plain and simple. But to me it felt less like admission than resignation, a story told because silence had grown heavier than speech. She asked me then if I had ever loved someone enough to betray them for their own good. I gave no answer. Some questions are not meant to be answered, only endured. When I left, the rain had begun again, soft and persistent, washing the streets clean of everything but memory. I walked without haste, the echo of her words accompanying me like the shadow of a knock that had never truly ceased. Lewis drove that night, the wipers marking out their slow, rhythmic beat across the windscreen. He was quieter than usual, his certainty now replaced by the weary satisfaction of a case concluded. Eleanor Dalrymple would be charged. The papers would call it a scandal. Margaret Copley's name would be carried briefly in headlines before fading into the polite oblivion of Oxford history. Lewis said as much in his practical way, his voice half swallowed by the hum of the engine. I nodded, though my mind was elsewhere. Through the glass I watched the city slip past. The colleges huddled against the rain, their stone walls gleaming faintly under the lamps, the streets littered with leaves pressed flat against the cobbles. I thought of Margaret's diary, of the fragments reduced to ash, of the single page that spoke of knocks no one had made. I thought too of the crossword grids, half completed, abandoned, the answers left waiting. The past rarely arranges itself as neatly as we hope. It lingers instead in unfinished lines, words withheld, questions suspended. Later, alone in my rooms, I poured a whiskey I barely touched. The silence pressed in around me, broken only by the occasional creak of floorboards in the corridor beyond. I found myself listening absurdly for a sound, a knock, the echo of Margaret's fear or perhaps her certainty. But the corridor remained empty, the air still. It is the absence of sound, not its presence, that unsettles most. On the desk lay the crossword I had been working the previous day. Only a few clues remained unanswered, and one in particular caught my eye. 6 letters to end without closure. I stared at it for a long time, pencil in hand, before setting it down unanswered. Some words resist solution, and perhaps they should. Eleanor's confession had been spoken with the precision of someone weary of lies, yet even in her truth there had been something withheld, a silence too deliberate. Mercy, she had called it, the morphine in the tea, but mercy is a word that rarely belongs to crime. Whether she acted out of fear, pride, or a kind of distorted love, I could not say. Nor did I wish to. Cases end in files and verdicts. People do not. Lewis would tell the story differently, in terms of evidence and motive, cause and effect. He would be right in his way. Yet what lingered for me was not the widow's confession, nor the mechanics of death, but the image of Margaret herself, turning at a sound in the night, hand upon the door, finding nothing but silence. That emptiness seemed to echo through every part of the case like a refrain. I finished the whiskey, though it had grown flat and warm. The rain had eased outside, leaving the streets washed clean, though never truly cleansed. I closed my eyes and thought of doors left ajar, of names written too carefully in registers, of voices caught between truth and misquotation. Each a fragment of a larger absence, and I wondered, not for the first time, if the loneliest sound in Oxford is not the rain against the glass, nor the bells tolling over the spires, but the silence that follows a knock that never truly came.